All right, so Chapter 4, Fueling the Fire, 1981. In 1981, players were clamoring for more games. Everyone was playing arcade games and bringing their friends to play with them. With the advent of games like Pac-Man the previous year, playing video games became more socially acceptable, and it was common for kids to go to the arcade for an outing with friends or even on a date. Some operators had to place limits on how many times in a row people could play a game without giving others a try. Stacking quarters on the game to show how many times you were going to play became a common tactic to commandeer a favorite game. Capitalizing on the exploding video game market, Destination Entertainment Center, Chuck E. Cheese, a chain of restaurants that combined video games, food, and an animatronics show, went public in 1981. Buyers of arcade machines now had more choices of games to purchase and started buying as many as they could so they would not miss out on the next hit game. In a month or two, a good game could earn back the money it cost to purchase, typically around $3,000. Everything after that was profit to fuel the fire of buying more new games and keeping players happy. By 1981, the video game industry was generating $5 billion annually and profits were still rising. When Donkey Kong was introduced in 1981, it became the now legendary Nintendo's first hit video game. Formed in 1889, Nintendo had been involved in many businesses, from a Japanese Hanafuda card maker to a taxi company to a toy company. It wasn't until the 1970s that the company tried its hand at video games. Donkey Kong was the first game developed by Shigeru Miyamoto, who went on to become one of the most famous and influential video game designers of all time. In Donkey Kong, players used a joystick to control a character through 4 different play screens. A button made the character jump so it could avoid obstacles. The first screen had the player's character trying to climb up platforms to get to the damsel in distress at the top. The player needed to avoid touching the rolling barrels by jumping over them or by smashing them with a hammer. Donkey Kong's gameplay ends at level 22 because a bug causes the game to kill the player after a few seconds of play. Nintendo was sued by Universal City Studios, which alleged that Donkey Kong violated their trademark of King Kong. Although there were some similarities, Nintendo ultimately won the lawsuit. Donkey Kong brought many new elements to video games. It was the first game to bring a narrative story to games by telling the tale of a princess stolen by a giant ape. Although it was a simple story, it has since become a classic tale told in countless games. The game also was the first platform game with a jump button. Platform games became a common format soon after this game. These involved the player's character moving and jumping between various platforms to stay alive. At the time it was released, Donkey Kong was the most complicated video game ever made. Each of the 4 stages was like developing a full game. The main character in the game originally was a carpenter called Jumpman. It was only after the release of the arcade game Mario Brothers in 1983 that the character's name was changed to Mario and he became a plumber. Since then, Mario and Donkey Kong have become 2 of the longest-running, most recognizable, and most successful characters in video game history, appearing in hundreds of games as sequels and spin-offs. They also have been licensed on countless products, including t-shirts, lunchboxes, plush toys, and pajamas. Frogger. Frogger was developed by Japanese company Konami and was licensed for worldwide distribution by Sega and Gremlin. Konami would go on to become a major player in the video game world, but at the time it did not have strong distribution channels. Like Pac-Man, Frogger had a whimsical universal theme that appealed to both men and women. This, along with unique gameplay, helped it achieve great success and widespread popularity. The game was simple to play but difficult to master. The goal was to get a frog from one side of the road to a dirt medium and then over a river and into its home. To do this, the player used a joystick to move the frog in one of 4 directions to dodge cars and jump on logs and alligator backs while avoiding snakes, alligators, snapping mouths, and fast otters. Bonuses were awarded for snatching bugs that momentarily appeared, escorting lady frogs home, and getting 5 frogs safely home. Once 5 frogs were placed in their homes, the level reset and the difficulty increased with more vehicles and faster-moving logs. Once 3 frogs were hit, the game was over. Frogger had been a player favorite ever since it was released. Oddly, no arcade sequels were ever made, but more than 30 versions of the game had been released for home game systems. It also spawned countless clones like Freeway with a chicken crossing the road that are still being made today. Galaga. Developed by Namco, Galaga was a sequel to the 1979 game Galaxian, and the gameplay was largely the same. The player controlled a spaceship located at the bottom of the screen with a joystick that moved the spaceship left and right. At the beginning of each stage, a twinkling star-filled background was empty. Then enemy aliens entered the screen in smooth flowing formation, settling into predefined spots in a large group formation. Once all of the enemies arrived on screen, some of them descended in formations to attack the player's ship by shooting at or trying to collide with it. The player used the fire button to launch missiles toward the aliens to destroy them. Namco produced a very small version of Galaga that was about the size of a 17-inch monitor for use on buses and airplanes. A unique twist was the addition of the tractor beam. Occasionally, a boss Galaga alien ship would swoop down and deploy a tractor beam that pulled in the player's ship. The player could then allow his ship to be captured and taken to the top of the screen. A reserve ship would be given to the player. When the boss Galaga was destroyed, the fighter would rejoin the player's ship attached to the side for double the firepower. Once all the aliens were destroyed, the player would advance to the next level. If 3 of the player's ships were destroyed, play ended. Galaga was one of the first games with a bonus stage. After every few levels, the player would play a challenging stage where patterns of aliens would momentarily fly on and off the screen, taunting the player to hit all of them. Having double firepower during these stages was essential to success. This top-selling game made several appearances in pop culture over the years, including in the 1982 movie War Games and the ABC television series Lost, 2004 to 2010, which featured a submarine called Galaga. The game has become a timeless classic, and many machines are still making money. It also spawned translations on practically every game system ever made. Turbo. Turbo was developed and sold by Sega Service Games of Japan, which got its start developing coin-op machines in the 1950s. The company later became a big player in the home console market, releasing the popular Genesis, Saturn, and Dreamcast gaming consoles. One of Sega's bigger hits up to this point, Turbo was a 3-dimensional racing game. The player's goal was not to win a race, but to pass a certain number of rival racers, usually 30, before time expired. If completed, the player progressed to the next stage, otherwise the game was over. In the ports to home game systems, the third level, which was like Galaxian, was left out of the game due to licensing issues. Turbo's gameplay was unique in that it was centered entirely on the passing of cars instead of a track that leaped back on itself with a start-to-finish line. Turbo also was the world's first full-color raster sprite scaling racing game viewed from the now common third-person perspective, meaning action is viewed above and behind the player's car. Although Turbo was not a huge success for Sega, it sold well enough to later spawn 2 sequels, Turbo Outrun and Turbo Outrunners. Gorf. Gorf was a multi-stage shooter developed by Midway Games. In typical shooter fashion, the player controlled a spaceship at the bottom of the screen that would shoot missiles toward waves of enemies at the top of the screen. The controller on this game was unique because it had a fire button built into a pistol grip. The player's goal was to defeat the Gorfian Empire in 5 separate missions. Gorf was the first game to feature distinct multiple levels of gameplay. The first mission was similar to Taito's Space Invaders. The second mission pit the player against 2 squads of diving ships, and each squad had a special ship in the center that fired long laser beams at the player as it moved. The third mission was similar to Namco's Galaxian. The fourth mission had the player fight a number of enemies that spiraled toward the player, shooting fireballs. The fifth mission had the player fight the Gorfian flagship. Gorf enjoyed some very memorable moments. It was widely recognized as one of the first games with synthesized speech, and it would heckle and threaten the player during the game. It also ranked players with a name based on how many waves were completed: Space Cadet, Space Captain, Space Colonel, Space General, Space Warrior, and finally Space Avenger. Gorf also was the first game to allow players to start with more ships by depositing more quarters before starting a game. Miss Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man was released by Bally, which was Midway at the time, and became the best-selling sequel of all time, but the game almost was never made. The original Pac-Man was created in 1980 by Namco and licensed to Bally/Midway to distribute in the United States. Bally became impatient, waiting for the sequel Super Pac-Man from Namco, and decided to make its own unauthorized sequel by buying the rights to a similar game called Crazy Auto, developed by General Computer Corporation. Bally changed the graphics to fit the Pac-Man universe and proceeded to build and sell the game without Namco's approval. It proved so successful that Namco eventually adopted it as an official title. The gameplay was nearly identical to that of Pac-Man, but improved in many ways. In Miss Pac-Man, there were 4 different mazes, and the ghost movement was much more random, which made them appear to be smarter. In the original Pac-Man, patterns could be followed to beat the game every time because the ghost always responded in the same way. In Miss Pac-Man, the ghosts would mix up their response, so it was impossible to define patterns that worked every time. Other minor additions, like more fruit, different intermission sequences, and 2 warp tunnels, added just enough for the game to feel fresh again. Like Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man has become a cultural icon, appearing in more than 15 television shows, including Friends and The Simpsons. It also was a central character in the Pac-Man animated TV series. The game remains popular today and still can be found in locations everywhere, making money. Stargate. Stargate was Williams' sequel to the widely successful game Defender. Designed by the same development team, it built upon the success of Defender. Despite being difficult to play, the game had a large following. In fact, Stargate is recognized as one of the hardest games of all time to play and master. Stargate's gameplay was similar to Defender's but added a number of key features. Yet another button was added for a total of 6 buttons to keep track of during play. The new button added an invisible feature that temporarily rendered the player's ships invisible, invulnerable, and was deadly to the touch. This was handy in the chaotic gameplay of Stargate. The joystick still moved the player's ship up and down, and the other 5 buttons remained the same. The big new feature was the inclusion of a series of concentric rectangles called the Stargate. If the player entered the Stargate, it would instantly transport into the area where landers were abducting as men. The radar at the top of the screen announced alert messages about what was happening in the game. 4 new aliens also were added, each with a unique function designed to destroy the player's ship. Although Stargate ultimately may have been too difficult for mass appeal, it still managed to gather a strong following in arcades, eventually selling more than 27,000 units. After just more than a decade, electronic arcade games have become entrenched in the mainstream as hundreds of manufacturers produce more and more games for more and more players. Arcade video games have become ubiquitous, mainstream icons of popular culture. One of the new enemies in Stargate, the Dynamo, breaks into several small space hums when shot. This is homage to the song Dynamo Hum by Frank Zappa. The Puka characters became an icon for Namco, appearing in many future Namco games such as Pac-Man World.